distinguished guest. It's a pleasure to be here and to focus on one of the least well-known sub-regional organizations in the world, and certainly among the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world, namely the Gulf Cooperation Council. We've made some progress over the years in the sense that few Americans anymore believe it has to do with the Gulf of Mexico, and not any, I believe, still regard it as possibly animal, vegetable, or mineral, but they're not sure which. I'll make my remarks first in terms of a little on background, context, and perspective of what the GCC is and what it is not, and then on aspects of GCC perceptions of American strategies, grand strategies and sub-grand strategies, and then end on what's of greatest need, concern, interest, objectives, insofar as the GCC countries themselves are pertinent to this discussion. In terms of background, few people are aware that the GCC came into existence under less than auspicious circumstances. Unlike the European Union, which it has used from the beginning till now as an exemplary model to follow or to judge itself, guide itself by in terms of its progress and achievements, there was no guarantee of the six countries' security, such as the EU had through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of 1949. There was no previous intra-regional organization such as the coal and steel community that the Europeans had upon which to build with regard to complementing their needs and concerns and interest. Neither was there the atmosphere of emotional devastation from the ravages of war in World War II, where 19 countries were laid on their back by one country that was disciplined and single issue oriented and industrial with behind its military might. Nor did they have the background of something like the Marshall Plan from 1947 that underwrote, that provided foreign direct investment and capitalization and trade and technology cooperation and the establishment of joint commercial ventures that would be of reciprocal reward and mutuality of benefit to the partners. The GCC countries had none of those four things to facilitate its founding and to give it the self-confidence that it would not fall apart like so many previous pie-in-the-sky aspirations for a regional political or other integration. In terms of the context, the language of the preamble to its charter is self-revealing in the sense of six countries with a broadly common culture, a broadly common history, a broadly similar, if not complementary, set of challenges in terms of their quest for modernization and development, and most relevant of all, the similarity of forms and systems and structures of government. And this last phrase, of course, precluded Iraq, precluded Yemen from being members of the GCC. And it also precluded Jordan, even though Jordan was similar in terms of a monarchy, but Jordan was not a member of the Gulf region per se. At the opening founding inaugural summit in Abu Dhabi in May of 1981, at the very last moment, Sultan Qaboos of Oman asked could he have the floor. Up until that particular moment, the proceedings had been rather bland and innocuous, talking about harmonizing educational curricula, civil aviation standards, weights and measures, and the like, and nothing really controversial, even though the fact that they were meeting alone was controversial in the eyes of Iran and Iraq, which were angry for being excluded and not included. Sultan Qaboos said it's fine for us to debate and discuss and have agreement and be cordial on all the things that we share in common and all the things that we're doing at the present time to strengthen our societies and to strengthen all six of us as a collective unit. But none of this will amount to anything if we do not build a wall to protect that which we have already achieved since all of us have obtained independence, our national sovereignty, our political independence, our territorial integrity, once the British abrogated their last treaties whereby Great Britain had responsibility for their defense in foreign relations. And Sultan Qaboos went further to say, and we will not be able to do this unless we cooperate economically and developmentally in terms of providing the financial wherewithal to build and sustain this wall of defense. In terms of what the GCC countries from then on, with Oman particularly in the lead from the beginning, but also with Bahrain, which had organizationally the longest nonstop relationship with the United States in terms of cooperating on national as well as regional and international issues pertaining to defense and security, along with Saudi Arabia being the biggest and the most diverse and quantitatively as well as qualitatively most intimately involved with the United States to provide stability and defense and security for the region. The GCC countries said these are the things that we can bring to this particular challenge to keep the region as stable as possible, as secure as possible, without which we have no chance to be prosperous. We have no chance to be protected and to be able to plan, to be able to prepare, to be able to anticipate, to be able to predict that which is coming down the road for ourselves and those who will follow from us. And so in terms of agreements and formalities that were strategic in their focus, Oman was the first and the oldest from 1979 in terms of a defense, 1980 rather, in terms of an access to facilities agreement. And 10 years later, 4 additional GCC countries, namely Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, entered into defense cooperation agreements with the United States. Saudi Arabia has no such agreement, but here we don't want to confuse form with function, in the sense that the Saudi Arabian component of this defense cooperation strategic set of dynamics is greater, arguably, than all of the other 5 combined. The things that the GCC countries brought to the table were arms procurement, in terms of identicality on the technology front, or when there weren't identicalities, at least there were interoperabilities between their equipment and ours. Also hyped up, stepped up training, as well as increased numbers of exercises, and an ongoing, almost nonstop relationship with the United States Central Command, which has this particular region as its primary area of responsibility. With regard to going from beyond those agreements in terms of on-the-ground empirical realities, there is a GCC-relevant land force in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. There is a naval force in terms of Bahrain as well as Oman, focused on the Hormuz Straits, through which every day 1/5 at least of all of the internationally traded hydrocarbon fuels pass through Oman's waters, not through Iran's, as many are misled to believe. And in terms of air facilities and assets and capabilities in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. With regard to the geopolitics related to the defense strategic aspects, you had the GCC helping to pass UN Resolution 598 of July the 15th, 1987, for the reflagging and the the ceasefire, the immediate ceasefire between Iran and Iraq and the 8-year-old Iran-Iraq war. That was the first unanimous United Nations Security Council vote on a war and peace issue since the Korean War. And the Korean War had been unanimous largely because the Soviet ambassador wasn't present when the vote took place. The frame of reference was that he was in the bathroom. I don't think he has gone to the bathroom since, but not in terms of votes as crucial as that one was. Iraq accepted it immediately. Khomeini took 13 months to accept it. With regard to the Kuwait crisis of 1991, 12 of the League of Arab States countries, the 6 GCC ones, brought 6 more together, the vote being 12-9, in favor of condemning what Iraq did in its invasion and occupation of Kuwait, and also on August the 10th, a landmark decision where the same votes, 12-9, passed calling for all Arab armies to mobilize and deploy to Saudi Arabia to prevent the invasion from spreading further. In terms of the geoeconomics of this, and with regard to the GCC countries, still wedded to the American dollar as the medium of their financial international transactions, although Kuwait has a basket of currencies. The biggest egg in the basket happens to be the dollar. And what that has done to assist in the ongoing preeminence of the American banking system worldwide, and in terms of the offshore banks in Bahrain that took up the slack after Lebanon in 1975 had its revolution or its rebellion in its civil war until 1988. Bahrain came in to fill the gap there. And in terms of what the United States has been doing with regard to our Department of Treasury, going to these countries more than to any other countries in the developing world to ask for assistance in terms of stability and predictability regarding the uses to which the GCC countries, several of which are annually in surplus because of their oil revenue receipts, can do in partnership with the United States for common purposes, in order to lessen the blows of the international housing crisis, mortgage crisis, financial crisis, economic crisis writ large. And in terms of geology, they know that they bring 40% of proven, not debatable, reserves with regard to the world's hydrocarbon fuels, and that the United States, the single largest consumer of this commodity, biggest importer of this commodity, biggest waster of this commodity, loudest crybaby with regard to its terms of relations with this particular commodity, has barely 2%. Saudi Arabia alone has 10 times the amount of reserves of the United States. Now, from that aspect, in terms of what they have been bringing to the table that has strategic interest and strategic value and utilitarian benefit, they are aware that the United States has aspects of a grand strategy and then other aspects of issue-specific strategies. What would pass for a grand strategy, although not named as such, would be the defense policy guidance of late 1992 that was drafted by someone known to most here, not necessarily in the most positive way, called Paul Wolfowitz, who posited that between then and 2020 AD, in order for the United States to remain the world's sole superpower, it would have to continue to excel in 5 areas: economically, financially, industrially, militarily, and technologically. And the second push question as to what was essential for excelling in these 5 areas was energy. And the aspect of whose energy, our energy or someone else's energy, was announced in terms of someone else's energy, because this is a finite, depletable resource, and it's cheaper elsewhere, and it's more abundant elsewhere. And if we use our own, we'll run out sooner rather than later, and we'll become weaker sooner rather than later, and this is not a strategic option for us. In terms of the sub-interest for which they are issue-specific strategies, they are the following in the descending order of priority, which some of you may disagree with, and that's fine. But the largest overriding one is a strategic interest in the perpetuation of peace and the avoidance of war. And where there are cross-border forays and vehemence and vitriolic exchanges and pronouncements from radical extremists, fanatical spokespeople, representatives, and leaders in the region, to ensure that they do not escalate in terms of a civil war or a war between countries in the region, because of what that would do to regional stability and security. A set of economic interests that are as straightforward as can be in terms of sheer access regardless of the price, regardless of the levels of production of this hydrocarbon fuel that fuels all economies in the world, rich and poor, big and small, new and old, and everything in between. In terms of policies, largely foreign policies, and yet there are italics, neon lights, and capital letters on this one, because where the GCC would prefer non-interference in their domestic affairs, the United States has not seen any reason not to interfere in their domestic affairs, but there hasn't been the reciprocity on the GCC side. Indeed, this is a bedrock strategic maxim of the GCC countries in terms of all the communiques that they have signed their names to in the last 40 years, non-interference in the domestic affairs of each other's countries. With regard to commerce, it used to be linked to the economic interest, but no, for the last 35 years it's been separated in terms of, because we are the world's single largest importer of this commodity, we have to lessen the overall net bill as best we can. And one way to do that is to export as much as we can in terms of our goods and our services and our technologies and other things that lower the overall drain on our treasury. The fifth interest has, by and large, been the defense cooperation one. Under George W. Bush, this one came higher on the list of sub-interest, but for most of the years before in the GCC's life, it had been number 5. And it's possible under the Obama administration, at least, that it would certainly be far less than it was under George W. Bush, with the drawdowns in Afghanistan, the drawdowns in Iraq, and statements like outgoing Secretary of Defense Robert Gates that other countries need to belly up to the bar and begin to pay a proportionate share of what it costs, namely $100 billion a year to protect this particular region. Notice that I haven't mentioned a single word about the soft power as a sub-interest, or let alone a grand strategic interest thus far. Here, in terms of democratization or increasing the level of popular participation in the national development process, or civil rights or gender rights or human rights. And this is because of my conviction, and those who share it in the region, that despite all of the ink we spill on this particular interest and all of the Sunday talk shows verbiage on this particular interest, at the end of the day, if we stand back, if we're clinically detached and objective and dispassionate, the conclusion is hard to miss, in the sense of that particular interest being psychologically indulgible but politically expendable. In terms now of the GCC's concerns on strategic fronts that relate to all of these aspects, the GCC's primary interest is for clarity in terms of what America's objectives really are, and transparency in terms of what those interests really are, because their number one priority is the ongoing maintenance and sustainment of political stability. And they have linked political stability to physical security in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of their capital assets, in terms of their facilities that produce this particular commodity that is a worldwide commodity in terms of use and responsibility. And without that kind of security and stability, they will not have the means to play the humanitarian role that they play, largely unnoticed and largely unrecognized, as they were amongst the first in the world to help the people of Bosnia, of Kosovo, and those as well of Afghanistan and Iraq. And Kuwait has been a leader in this. So has Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and increasingly Qatar there. That this too cannot take place without the requisite stability and security. Believe it or not, Kuwait and the UAE provide more than 115 countries with various forms of humanitarian aid and developmental assistance. So they see these as linked. And what they seek more than anything else, and I'm speaking here from a point of view of empathy, here is that two issues leave them with uncertainty and a lack of clarity as to where the United States is coming from or headed or likely intending to arrive. and one has to do with Iran, which we can discuss more in the Q&A. But the larger one, the older one, the more massive and pervasive one is the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And here, in terms of looking at the United States, a country of 310 million, the lenses are ones that show at the other end of the prism executive branch cowardice, congressional timidity, in terms of being intimidated by the representatives, the agents, the sympathizers, the fifth columns, the Trojan horses of a country of 8 million people at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that has successfully been able to intimidate the head of state of the 310 million. I think Bill Quant made reference to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu getting more standing ovations than did the President of the United States, in whose country he was speaking to the Congress there. And with regard to the human rights aspect, which have come up a lot in the case of Bahrain, and as I said before, no country in the region has been a more steadfast defense and strategic partner of the United States since 1948 nonstop than Bahrain. They would counter that there is no universally agreed, no globally acknowledged, no internationally consensus on human rights per se as to what they cover and what they do not cover. They acknowledge civil rights, human rights, gender rights as such, but they add to these that any country, any government, any people who have the means will be faulted on the altar of human rights in the Richter scale of human wrongs, if indeed they do not do the maximum to provide housing for the homeless. Here in the nation's capital this evening, like last evening, like tomorrow evening, there will be 13,000 people who are homeless, okay? This is in the nation's capital of the strongest, wealthiest power in history in the world. In New York City this evening, there will be 36,000 who are homeless, 18,000 of whom are children. And multiply that by St. Louis, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, and other urban centers in the United States, and you'll see how the United States falls short on that particular criterion regarding human rights, as well as health care. And we are the only industrialized country's economy to lack universal comprehensive wealth care, even though we've got an economy that dwarfs almost all of the other major industrial economies of the world. Not to mention education, which is also free of charge, from kindergarten all the way through the PhD and obtaining one's certificate as a neurosurgeon. Not to mention as well crime. That 1/4 of all the people on the planet who are behind bars here, of the 212 countries in the world. This is its own indictment in terms of human rights and human wrongs. Thank you.